This is the true story of Mintauts Blosfelds, a Latvian soldier who endured the brutal collapse of the Eastern Front, fought alongside German forces against the Red Army, and made a harrowing retreat from the ruins of Russia back toward his homeland. From frostbitten trenches to burning villages, from firefights in the forests of Estonia to his final escape aboard an overloaded ship out of Riga, Blosfelds witnessed the last desperate gasps of a war that was already lost. But this isn't just another war story. It's the voice of a man trapped between two empires, watching his country fall into Soviet hands, trying to survive with nothing left but instinct, grit, and the hope of one more sunrise. We were told to report to the company commander that morning. He gave us a short, tired nod, then waved us off with orders to rest before nightfall, before the retreat. I wasn't particularly tired, not yet, so I sat alone on my bunk, scribbled a quick letter home. Nothing dramatic, just words, as if pretending normal life still existed somewhere beyond the smoke and frost. But before I could drift off, the door of the bunker slammed open so violently it felt like an explosion. A runner stood in the doorway, pale as death, eyes wide. He shouted, "Stand to! Russian attack! Incoming!" His voice cracked under the weight of panic. For a second we were stunned, then we leapt into motion. Rifles, helmets, grenades. The sound outside confirmed everything. Distant but ferocious shelling, not right on us, but close, too close. Judging by the pounding, it was the trenches just north of our position getting hammered, the right flank of the 33rd Regiment. The ground shook with each impact, a constant stomach-churning rumble. Our own mortars were silent, gone. The artillery had pulled out hours ago. We were being left to face this with whatever we had on our backs. We crouched in the tree line, straining to understand the tempo of the barrage. For half an hour the shelling didn't let up, then it shifted. You could feel the change, less distant, more focused. The infantry were coming, we could hear it. Faint Russian shouting carried on the wind, like ghosts in the smoke. Somewhere behind me, our company commander was barking into the telephone. I'll never forget his voice, tight, frantic, but still forceful. "Whatever you do, don't let them break through the gap between the lakes. If they do, everything's lost." I didn't know if he was speaking to the 33rd Regiment or our outpost on the far left, a strong point ahead of our trench line with machine guns positioned directly over that narrow passage between the lakes. If he was calling them, it was already too late. A runner came stumbling back from that strong point. His face was white as ash. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He opened his mouth to report, but before he could speak, the flare gun on his belt accidentally fired. The flare shot downward, straight into his boot, and he collapsed, screaming. We tore the leather away from his leg, seared black with fresh burns, and hastily wrapped it. He limped off toward the rear, still shaking. His words had been simple. "They're through." The Russians had broken through the line held by the 33rd after an absolutely merciless bombardment. Their trenches had caved in. Anti-tank guns had zeroed in on our strong point, pinning down our machine gunners so tightly they couldn't lift their heads without taking a bullet. The men were either buried or bleeding. No one dared return fire. We waited. Soon their guns shifted. Our position became the target. Shells came screaming through the air, exploding in the birchwoods around us. Trees were split open like matchsticks. Splinters the size of daggers sliced through the air. Earth exploded skyward. It felt like the entire forest was under siege. The air itself shook. I looked down at the trench wall and saw my own hands gripping the rifle so tight my knuckles had turned white. Still, we waited. We clutched our grenades. We checked the safety on our rifles. We listened for the sound of boots in the underbrush. But the attack never came. Not yet. Instead, we were given the signal. It was time to move. Time to leave this death trap behind. The company commander emerged from his bunker, his face grey with exhaustion, but still sharp. He told us we'd be the last to leave. Rearguard. We would hold the line just long enough for the rest of the company to melt into the forest and disappear. We nodded. No complaints. It was what we were there for. We followed the edge of the lake and passed a group of legionnaires manhandling a heavy anti-tank gun, dragging it through the woods by sheer will. No horses, no trucks, just sweat and desperation. As we crested a hill, we caught sight of the company, the entire column, moving below us in open fields. From our elevated position, we could see another column off in the distance, descending from the hills behind our old front. But the distance was too great. We couldn't tell if they were ours or Russian. The heat was unbearable. The air was thick, and the weight of our packs pressed down like iron. My shirt was soaked through. I could feel sweat trickling down my spine as we marched across the sun-baked clearing. Every footstep felt like it echoed, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, gunfire. It started with a crack, then a barrage of rifle shots and bursts from light machine guns. Tracers zipped overhead, red and green streaks slicing through the sky. The fire was coming from the woods to our right. For a moment, confusion set in. Men shouted, some ducked, others dropped prone. Then, our commander raised his hand and pointed toward the tree line. We didn't hesitate. The whole company turned and sprinted. Within seconds, we reached the edge of the forest. I threw myself down and swung my machine gun into position. My fingers found the trigger and let off a burst, sharp, instinctive, suppressive. But I couldn't see a damn thing. The birch trees were too thick, their white trunks blurring everything. I stopped firing. Others did the same. The forest went still. No return fire, no voices, just the low hum of tension. We held position. We waited. And then, slowly, we began to understand. Whoever had taken shots at us wasn't eager to continue. Maybe our charge had thrown them off. Maybe they were probing us. But for now, the danger passed. The attackers had clearly melted away, and with no time to sweep the forest for stragglers, we pulled back into the open field. Orders were barked, and we quickly reformed into rough platoon groups before pushing onward. The woods to our right gradually thinned out, and soon the company was descending into a shallow depression in the ground. Then, without warning, it happened. Gunfire ripped into us from the right flank, a sudden, ferocious burst of machine gun fire delivered at close range. It was devastatingly accurate, and the effect was immediate. Chaos exploded within our ranks. Shouts turned to screams. The company commander, trying to rally us and raise his arm for a counterattack, was hit and crumpled to the ground. In a matter of seconds, bodies littered the open field. Some men tried to run. Others hit the dirt, but there was barely any cover. And the Russian machine gun didn't stop. By the time our group emerged from the tree line, we were met with a sight that turned the stomach. The depression was filled with fallen comrades, many dead, some writhing, crawling feebly toward the rye field beyond. A few of the wounded still moved, dragging themselves through the mud in a desperate attempt to reach safety. But the Russian fire picked them off one by one, their machine gun, clearly visible on a low rise just a couple 100 yards away, kept up its deadly rhythm. I could even make out figures near the weapon, Russians standing shouting for our men to surrender. They hadn't seen us yet. We were still in the birch's shadow. That tiny window of concealment might be our only chance. I dropped flat to the ground, steadied my machine gun, lined up the crew, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The weapon clicked but didn't fire. I yanked the bolt to eject the round. Jammed. I tried again, harder. Still jammed. I reached for the top cover to pry it open, but it wouldn't budge. The weapon was dead. I was helpless. All I had now were my legs. The Russians spotted us. Bullets snapped through the air, kicking up dirt all around. Then, just behind me, came the rattle of a machine pistol. My friend the corporal had opened fire to draw their attention. It worked. The volume of fire dipped slightly, giving us just enough time to move. I ran, or tried to. The thick, waterlogged marsh sucked at my boots with every step. My ski boots felt like anchors. The useless weight of the jammed gun dragged at my arms. The corporal caught up beside me, saw my struggle, and yelled, "Don't mess about! Ditch the bone saw and get into the rye." He'd fired all his rounds. We had no firepower left, and the Russians were ramping up again. Without hesitation, I hurled the machine gun as far as I could into the marshy water and bolted forward. Together, we reached the edge of the rye field. Russian rounds hissed through the stalks behind us, but we hit the ground and crawled fast and low, pushing forward with every ounce of strength left in us. At last, we crossed into the sheltering trees and vanished into the forest's cover. We regrouped near the tree line, just a handful of us now, the remains of the company. No one spoke. We tossed a few grenades blindly into the lakeside bushes to deter pursuit, then moved westward through the woods in silence, each man gripped by the same thought. Were we already surrounded? We didn't know, but we had almost no weapons left between us. I still had 2 grenades at my belt and one clenched tightly in my hand, ready to be thrown at the first sound of pursuit. After a long march through the forest, we reached a bridge spanning the river Velikaya, near what had once been the 32nd Regiment's headquarters. Now it was just smouldering ruins, bunkers charred black, no sign of command, no officers, no maps, just 2 weary observers crouched in the undergrowth, keeping watch for the advancing enemy. We told them what had happened. They barely nodded. Then we moved on. The road west stretched long and empty. We walked all afternoon, boots dragging through the dust. By the time we reached the outskirts of Krasnoye, darkness had fallen and the village burned. Somewhere up ahead, a house lit the road in flickering orange light. Flames danced along a stone wall that ran alongside the road's left-hand side, a wall now riddled with bullet holes. The gunfire was still coming, somewhere from the right. The Russians had pushed this far already. To get through, we dropped into the ditches and crawled. Bullets cracked overhead like angry insects. Any vehicle brave enough to try had to race through the gauntlet at full speed. There was no safety here. Just beyond the village, we were stopped by an officer. Desperation lined his face. He begged us to check out a clump of trees roughly 500 yards to the right. He thought the enemy might be massing there. He promised fire support from a row of anti-aircraft guns he'd stationed on the road, already pointed north. But then he looked us over, our torn uniforms, the mud, the blood, the empty belts. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were escapees. He shook his head. "Go to the rear, boys," he said, his voice softer now. "But get yourselves some weapons. You'll need them." He didn't need to repeat himself. We barely made it 20 steps down the road when fresh artillery shells rained into the village behind us. Flames soared into the night sky. From the tree line he'd wanted us to inspect, we heard shouting, Russian voices. They were already there. A massive piece of shrapnel screamed overhead and slammed into the road ahead, throwing up a thick cloud of dust. We dropped instinctively, hearts pounding, then broke into a half-crouched run, trying to get as far away from the blast zone as fast as possible. And then we walked through the night, no words, just the steady shuffle of boots, the rustle of gear, and the echo of gunfire far behind us. The endless stretch of blackened forest we'd just passed through was said to be the Germans' doing, torched deliberately to deny the partisans cover near the main road. Now a dense haze of smoke hung over everything. The sight of those scorched trees, once proud and tall, now reduced to splintered husks, stirred an unsettling thought in many of us. One day, it might be our own homeland burning like this. We were exhausted. After marching through the night without sleep, all we wanted was a few hours of rest, believing we'd finally placed enough distance between ourselves and the advancing Russians. As the morning mist began to lift with the slow rise of the sun, we emerged from the woods and stepped out into open terrain. Visibility was excellent now. You could see for miles, and soon someone up ahead pointed out something strange in the distance, a tall wooden fire watch tower, easily a couple of miles away. It had a red flag fluttering at the top. A murmur rippled through the column. Had the Russians really pushed this far already? It didn't seem possible. A group of German soldiers stationed along the roadside assured us it was probably just partisans playing tricks, nothing more, and that the main Soviet forces were still further east. Whether they believed it or were just trying to keep everyone calm, we couldn't say. We continued on foot for another hour before finally being allowed to leave the road and rest on the grassy slope of a steep embankment. Off to our right, the countryside opened into vast flatlands, meadows and farmland stretching out beneath the glare of the sun. We scanned it anxiously for any sign of enemy movement, but all was quiet, serene even. The heat shimmered on the horizon in rising waves, and one by one the men started to doze off under the sun's weight. That calm didn't last long. The low hum of approaching aircraft stirred the sleepers and brought everyone to alert. We stood, shielding our eyes, straining to pinpoint their direction. Then we saw them, 3 planes coming in fast and low from the direction of the burnt-out forest behind us. They flew with the sun at their backs, making identification difficult. Russian or German, no one knew. Just to be safe, we dove into the roadside ditches and waited. Only when they passed overhead, close enough for us to see the pilots' faces in their cockpits, did we spot the red stars on the wings. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, flying so low they might have touched the treetops, but they didn't fire. No bombs, no strafing, just a pass, then they climbed sharply and disappeared to the east. Not long after, word came we were moving again, but thankfully not far. We crossed a line of freshly dug trenches before being split into smaller squads and shown the section of the new front line we were to hold. The position was strong. The trenches ran along low ridges with forward strong points carved into the approach. All vegetation in front had been cleared, trees felled, bushes uprooted, leaving only ankle-high stumps tangled with barbed wire. What impressed us most were the bunkers, real ones, deep underground with dual entrances, reinforced overhead with crossed timber beams in thick layers. They'd been expertly camouflaged. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you'd never guess a single one was there. Whoever had built this line had taken their time, and it was clear the intention was to stand firm here. But that would take manpower, and we were painfully short. After days of retreat, each company had maybe 20 men left, and most had little more than rifles and helmets. The commanders worked with what they had, shuffling men into positions and plugging gaps. Some were sent to dig fresh communication trenches from bunkers to the machine gun nests. I was assigned elsewhere, with a group of fellow legionnaires. Our task was to secure the rear. Roughly a mile behind our line stood a small village. We were to clear it, simple on paper, but we knew even the quietest-looking cluster of homes could be crawling with partisans. We approached carefully, watching for movement, listening for the telltale rustle of boots or whispered Russian voices. But nothing stirred. We bolted across the fields and reached the first house. One man kicked open the door while the rest of us covered him from behind with rifles raised. Empty. The next house, also deserted. But eventually we found them, about 10 civilians huddled together in one small room, silent and terrified. We posted a guard and swept the rest of the village, but no one else turned up. One of the legionnaires who spoke Russian ordered the group to leave at once and head toward Opochka. They refused. They insisted they'd only just fled here from the Russians and wanted to rest for a day or two before continuing their journey. The men in particular grew agitated, defiant even, but there was no time to argue. We made our point clearer. Weapons drawn. That changed their minds. They packed their things quickly and trudged across the fields, casting angry looks back at us as they went. With the village now cleared, we began looking for anything useful. Chickens clucked and scratched near one of the cottages, but they were too quick, darting under floorboards before anyone could grab them. A few legionnaires had better luck spotting a pig in the field. They shot it cleanly and dragged the body back toward the trenches, cheering as they went. Someone found a large metal cauldron to cook it in, and spirits soared. Back at the line, I changed into my swimming trunks and joined the men digging the trench. Others were butchering the pig nearby, laughing and elbow-deep in fat and blood. For a brief moment, it felt like the war had paused. But then came the sound we all feared. A pair of shells slammed into no man's land, tall fountains of dirt and smoke erupting with a sharp crack. At first, we thought it might be our own artillery ranging the field, but the next shell landed much closer. Then another. It was clear now. This was Russian. We dropped our tools and sprinted for the bunker, diving for cover along the way as a Soviet plane swooped overhead, machine guns rattling. We dressed fast, buckled on our gear, and climbed back into the trench, rifles reloaded and hands steady. The sound of gunfire to our left was growing louder. Through the distant haze, we heard shouting, the harsh clack of machine pistols, and, unmistakably, tank tracks grinding along the road near a village about a mile north. A line of legionnaires emerged from the village, retreating under fire, taking cover in ditches and returning fire toward the houses. A Soviet tank rumbled after them, barreling straight down the tree-lined road swinging south toward our rear. Now we were facing disaster. Artillery still pounded our front, but the Russians were circling behind. We were about to be flanked and attacked from both sides. The CO hesitated. We were too few to hold, but no orders had come from above. All communications were down, no link to the regiment, no orders from division, just a thin line of men, boxed in and running out of time. We waited for nearly 15 minutes, watching the battle play out up the road. Then it happened. The legionnaires broke and fled their position. Behind them came a wall of Soviets, two groups, one chasing them southward and the other advancing directly on us. The decision was made. There was no time for speeches. We abandoned the trenches, climbed out, and slipped away into the dead ground behind the hills, running full tilt toward another village further west. The sun was scorching now. Our uniforms were soaked in sweat, mouths dry as ash. We came upon a small, peaceful lake, its surface like glass, untouched. Without hesitation, every man stopped to drink. Not a word was said. The village sat on a low hill, and from its edge we could see the Russians moving in behind us, a long, unwavering line. But now we had the advantage. Good elevation, clear fields of fire. We set up along the fence at the edge of the village and waited. When they entered range, we opened up. They were clear targets, moving across ploughed fields with barely any cover. They dropped one by one, some rolling, others simply folding and disappearing into the dirt. We shouted to each other through the gunfire, just like the rifle range. But the return fire came soon after. The rest had taken cover in ditches, and now their bullets zipped past us. They were facing directly into the afternoon sun, blinded by the glare, while we remained in the village's long shadow. It was far from over, but for the first time in days, we were no longer running. The shadows cast by the village trees gave us some comfort, but our attention stayed fixed on the left flank. The Russians had still been pressing from that direction, until the familiar rattle of German machine guns suddenly filled the air. We heard it clearly from the tree line, and with it came a flicker of relief. We weren't alone, but that brief calm was shattered again. Soon after, rifle fire crackled behind us, then machine guns, and not a few scattered shots, sustained bursts. Our hearts sank. If the Russians were now behind us as well, then we were encircled. We'd have nowhere left to run. I called for 2 men, and we moved quickly, crouched low, weaving between the rear houses of the village to scout what was happening. As we edged around the last row of buildings, we saw the truth. A full company, maybe more, of legionnaires advancing across the fields in a firing line, and they were shooting directly into the village, at us. Their gunners had clearly mistaken us for the enemy. Bullets struck the walls around us again and again in a steady rhythm. We couldn't stick our heads out, let alone make ourselves seen. It was obvious. They believed the Russians had already taken the village. Acting quickly, someone tied a white handkerchief to the tip of a bayonet and waved it around a corner. I did the same with my helmet, holding it out just far enough to be noticed. At last, the gunfire stopped. We rose from cover, arms waving, shouting, desperate to make ourselves known. Just in time, the legionnaires were barely 100 yards away, weapons raised, preparing to storm the village. They lowered their rifles. Instantly, we were swarmed with questions. 2 officers arrived soon after, and I reported the situation as clearly and quickly as I could. Within moments, the new troops moved up and blended into our line, reinforcing the defence. In my short absence, something had happened. My friend, the corporal, was gone. I asked around and was told he'd been hit and carried to the centre of the village. I found him inside a small house, lying pale and still on a crude bed of blankets. He'd taken a bullet through the side. His face was drained of colour, lips dry, hands trembling. "Don't leave me to the Russians," he kept saying over and over, barely louder than a whisper. "You won't be," I promised. I would get him out. I ran back to the edge of the village and pulled 3 men from the line. We fashioned a stretcher using rifles and ground sheets and lifted him carefully. He was a big man. Carrying him was slow, painful work. Our arms ached, shoulders burned, sweat poured down our backs. Every 100 yards we had to stop for breath, but we didn't stop for long. Eventually, we reached the next village, where the temporary headquarters of the Latvian Legion had been set up. There was a doctor, but no vehicle, no ambulance. High-ranking officers clustered in small groups, watching the front line through binoculars on tripods. Camouflaged anti-tank guns were hidden in the orchards and hedgerows, their barrels trained toward the east. We laid the corporal down gently. When we lifted him off the stretcher, we saw the ground sheet soaked red beneath him. I sent the others back to the front and stayed beside him. In the chaos of headquarters, no one noticed or questioned me. I wasn't leaving my friend. Half an hour later, an ammunition wagon was heading to the rear. They allowed him on board, and I climbed up with him. We rode together until we reached a casualty station a few miles away. There we parted. He didn't say much, just reached out and gripped my hand. His face was still grey, lips tight with pain, but his eyes said enough. I turned back alone. By the time I returned to headquarters, darkness had fallen. A battery of our field guns had taken up position near the road, hidden in dense brush. Their barrels flashed in the gloom, belching thick smoke that clung to the trees like a ghostly mist. Nearby, our anti-aircraft guns were firing, long arcs of tracer cutting through the dark between villages, aimed at Russian positions that still hadn't broken through. I couldn't bring myself to return to the front that night. I was dead on my feet, 3 days of retreat, fighting, carrying the wounded, no sleep. I'd heard that our supply unit was billeted a few miles further back, so I headed that way. The commander of the supply unit had known me back in the guards company. When I arrived, he greeted me warmly. "You look like hell," he said. "Stay, I've got work for you." He explained they'd been hit by Russian aircraft the day before and would be relocating in the morning. One of his drivers had been wounded. I could take his place. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to abandon my unit, but he waved my concern away. "Don't be stupid," he said. "You've earned a breather." He was right. I was torn, but the exhaustion won. I stayed, at least for the night. We fed the horses, shared a quick supper, and curled up inside the wagons with nothing but horse blankets to cover us. The front was quieter now, though Russian aircraft still buzzed overhead from time to time. They didn't bomb us directly, focusing their attacks on the supply roads further behind. We watched their flares drift down slowly, lighting up the black horizon like falling stars. We'd survived the day, but none of us believed that peace would last. When I rejoined the supply unit of our company, only 2 wagons remained out of the 10 or 12 we'd started with. The rest had been lost, abandoned, or destroyed along the chaotic route. The surviving men were slumped in the bushes, catching what rest they could after yet another long, exhausting night on the move. Orders hadn't yet come, so we waited. As evening fell, the warm air hung still around us as we set off again, this time heading south. The wagons were overloaded, piled high with whatever supplies had been salvaged, the most essential remnants of our company's gear. None of the drivers rode on the carts. They walked beside them in silence, each leading his team of horses, and one cart pulled along a spare horse. It had taken shrapnel during a recent air raid, but was still on its feet, though limping. We reached Stiglova and had to wait near a small church for our turn to continue down the road. While we rested in the dusk, someone pointed upward. A strange light appeared in the sky, like a lone star moving slowly toward us from the south. It followed no straight path, wavering as it moved, and there was no sound, no engine, no hum. It didn't behave like any aircraft we knew, especially since no wartime plane would fly with visible navigation lights. What it was remains a mystery to this day. By morning, we crossed the Rezekne highway near Berzgal and continued on through Ragauka, Driseni, then turned north again. We expected to skirt around the northern end of Lake Lubanas and pass through Bikava, but instead of continuing north, the route curved south once more. Eventually, we arrived at the southern tip of the lake and turned west toward Varaklani. By this point, we had been on the road for days. Sleep came in brief intervals, stolen beside roadside ditches. The wounded horse hadn't improved, still limping, its strength clearly fading. It needed rest, not more endless marching. Near Varaklani, we traded the poor creature to a local farmer in exchange for 2 bottles of vodka. Most of our journey took us along narrow country roads. The main highways were clogged with Latgalian civilians, long lines of carts and people fleeing the Russian advance. Those who stayed behind were either too old or too loyal to the Soviets to flee. Russian aircraft attacked the main roads frequently, strafing and bombing refugees. Many died where they stood, their carts overturned, horses shredded by gunfire. On the smaller roads, we were relatively safe, but even there, the eastern sky echoed with the constant growl of artillery. The front was never far behind. From Varaklani, we took the road toward Madona, but before reaching the town, we turned north again and made for Lubana. There, in a quiet wooded area, we halted for an entire day. It was a rare moment of peace. We slept outdoors under the wagons, and thanks to the supplies we still carried, we had more than enough food and drink. The surrounding landscape, with Lake Lubana and its swamps to our east, and the river Ivikste behind us, formed a natural defensive cradle. It gave us a sense, however fleeting, that we were out of reach for the moment. We pressed on, passing through a dense forest, hugging the northern edge of the impassable swamp, and emerged in the more open country of Vidzeme, central Latvia. The trees on either side of the road had been wired with explosive charges, likely rigged to collapse across the path when the Russians came. The enemy was expected here. Along the roadside we saw 2 graves, simple wooden crosses rising from the grass, a German helmet placed on each one. The partisans had left their mark, even here. The next few days passed in steady, slow travel across Vidzeme. No one truly knew where we were headed. That changed at the end of July, when a new order came down. Only 1 man was to remain with each cart. The rest of us were to dismount and form up at the roadside. Platoons were organised, weapons redistributed, and we began marching south once more. Our progress was steady. We passed through Lobert and eventually arrived in Cockneys one warm afternoon. There we halted, lined up, and about 50 names were read aloud. We, the chosen few, all legionnaires from our regiment, were told to wait for German army transport. As we waited in the shade, I wandered into a nearby orchard. Black currant bushes lined the edges, their fruit hanging heavy and ripe. I picked handfuls, devouring them until my fingers were stained and my stomach finally felt full. For a fleeting moment, I felt human again. When the trucks arrived, we climbed aboard and drove for around 3 hours. By the end of the journey, we reached divisional headquarters, situated roughly 20 miles from Riga. That night, we slept in a barn, thick with hay and the faint smell of livestock. It was quiet, warm, safe. During the evening roll call, the officer stepped forward and began to read off the names of men who would receive the Iron Cross the following morning. My name was among them. I was stunned. I hadn't known anything about a recommendation. It turned out that one of our officers had put me forward for my attempt to destroy the Russian machine gun back on July 10th during the ambush. I hadn't succeeded. The gun jammed, but apparently the effort had not gone unnoticed. Morning came quickly. After breakfast we cleaned ourselves up, brushed the dust from our uniforms, and lined up for the ceremony in a clearing beside the forest. The divisional commander inspected the men, then called forward those who had been awarded the medal. There were about 20 of us. He walked down the line, one by one, pinning the Iron Cross to each man's buttonhole and shaking our hands. When he reached me, he nodded with something close to pride. I didn't know what to say. Soon after, we boarded trucks and made for Riga. The city welcomed us as if we had returned from a great victory. Crowds lined the streets. Civilians waved and threw packets of cigarettes into the beds of the trucks. Young women stepped forward with flowers, tucking them into our belts or buttonholes. To them, we were heroes, defenders of the capital. They didn't know the truth, that Jelgava had already fallen days ago in a surprise tank assault. The Russians had reached the Baltic coast and split Latvia in 2, but in that moment, in their eyes, we were the front line, and among us, the newly decorated stood out. The Iron Cross, worn traditionally on the buttonhole for the first 24 hours, drew attention. I felt their eyes on me, not with fear or sadness, but with admiration. The parade ended at a delousing station. We were scrubbed down, issued clean uniforms, and sent to the artillery barracks. This was now the base of our new formation, Battle Group Jekyll, hand-picked men from both Latvian divisions, placed under the direct command of General Jekyll himself. The next day we were fully re-equipped. New Panzer Grenadier uniforms, high-quality arms, ammunition. We trained and ate with a nearby German unit and were even permitted brief leave in the evenings. But the discipline was strict. We drilled hard, jumping from trucks, forming up on the road, engaging in simulated combat. Our weapons were unfamiliar but effective. British-designed Bren light machine guns, Czech submachine guns, and rifle-mounted grenade launchers. The officers leading us were hardened veterans, survivors of years on the Eastern Front. They pushed us hard. After a week, things relaxed slightly. In the field, when the officers weren't watching, we lounged beneath trees or rested quietly, waiting for the trucks to bring us home. Then, the announcement came. On the morning of August 11th, we left the artillery barracks for training as usual. But by 10 a.m. we were recalled and told to prepare for immediate deployment in full battle gear. There was no time to waste. Ammunition was handed out, gear checked, and by midday we rolled out of Riga, heading north. We drove through the afternoon and halted near the Estonian border, resting in a patch of woodland until nightfall. That evening, General Jekyll himself arrived. His small Fieseler Storch plane landing nearby, he inspected the assembled troops and addressed us directly. The Russians had broken through in the north. Their armoured spearhead was now cutting across Estonia toward the coast. Our mission was simple: delay them, hold them back long enough for heavier German formations to arrive and stabilise the front. Later that night, more units joined us: German military police, an anti-tank company, and supply detachments. We were issued rations for the next day and prepared to move again. After dark, we loaded into trucks once more and headed deeper into Estonia. Enemy aircraft struck during the night. They missed us, but bombed the road ahead, destroying supply vehicles and setting buildings ablaze. We dismounted and took cover, waiting for the skies to clear. By morning, the countryside was beautiful, rolling green hills bathed in soft sun. But by mid-morning, a heavy fog descended, slowing our advance. When we reached our assigned position, we dismounted. All was quiet. There was no sign of the Russians, but the villagers knew they were close. The Estonians were packing their carts, women sobbing quietly as they prepared to abandon their homes. None of them wanted to stay under Soviet rule. Our officers gave us a rough defensive line. I split my platoon into 3 groups and posted them about 400 yards apart in the thick brush. Then we waited. The rifle grenades didn't fit properly on our launchers. While we waited in silence, I used a knife to shave the plastic down until they would sit correctly. We didn't expect to hold. The plan was to strike in ambush, then pull back before the tanks arrived. By midday, new orders arrived. The Russian column had shifted direction. We were to move again, to cut them off. Half an hour later, we arrived at the new position, and this time, as we stepped out into the fields and moved toward a low ridge, we could hear the battle ahead. It was close now. To our left, the German military police company spread out quickly into position. We Latvians held the centre, and the anti-tank gun crews set up on the right. Their guns were hauled straight up the hill without pause and began firing almost immediately. At first it seemed hasty, even reckless, but as we reached the hilltop and peered across the rolling landscape beyond, it all made sense. The land below was crawling with Soviet armour and trucks, tanks idling in formation, supply vehicles bunched up on narrow dirt roads, crews standing around. We'd caught them off guard. The Red Army had no idea we were here. Then came the Stukas. From high above, the familiar shriek of dive bombers pierced the sky, followed by devastating bursts of anti-tank fire, bombs dropping into clustered convoys, and strafing runs that scattered Soviet infantry like dust. The chaos unfolded beneath us, trucks torn apart, tanks immobilized, entire formations thrown into disarray. We watched the slaughter unfold like spectators from a theatre balcony. But it didn't last. Once the Stukas peeled away to refuel, the Soviets recovered fast. Their guns found the positions of our anti-tank batteries first and began methodically knocking them out. One by one, those brave gun crews were silenced, their weapons shattered. Now the spotlight shifted. It was our turn. Tank shells began raining down on our hills. Fast, brutal, and without warning. We hadn't had time to dig in, and now we were paying the price. Men dove for cover behind rocks, under carts, into natural folds of the terrain. The explosions were deafening. Shrapnel tore through the air. We lost several good men in those opening minutes, and yet we held. When the tanks finally moved forward to finish us, the German MPs fired back with handheld anti-tank rockets. 2 enemy tanks were hit and left burning in the open, their crews shot as they tried to escape the inferno. More burning wrecks dotted the countryside, courtesy of the Stukas. Thick black smoke columns rose into the sky, hanging motionless in the still afternoon air. The Russians shifted tactics. Their tanks stayed back while the infantry pressed forward, but they were met by our concealed machine guns. Whole lines of Soviet troops were cut down before they could reach us. The survivors faltered, then turned to flee. Behind them, political officers screamed orders, fired wildly with pistols, even shooting their own men in the back to force them forward. It didn't work. The enemy buckled, retreated, and eventually changed course altogether, deciding to bypass us entirely. We had held them, a small, battered force, and now they moved around our left flank, seeking easier ground. In the thick of that barrage, a fragment of metal caught me. A shell burst nearby, and I didn't feel it at first, but then the throb came. My left cheek had been torn open by a shard. It went straight through, took out half a tooth, and left my tongue gashed. The pain caught up to me quickly. My eye was nearly swollen shut. Blood ran into my collar. The company medic examined me where I sat. He wrapped my wound and tied a wounded tag to my tunic, marking me for evacuation. As the battle group began pulling back, our transport arrived, but I still had to walk to the casualty station. Crossing the fields, I watched enemy machine gun fire ripple through the corn, cutting it down in deadly straight lines. Rockets from Soviet launchers screamed overhead, pounding the retreating line with salvo after salvo. After a mile of trudging through the smoke and thunder, I reached an Estonian village where a temporary aid post had been set up. There was no transport yet, so I waited. Shells began falling nearby. Enemy tanks pushed forward through the woods and opened fire on the village. I dove into a ditch alongside a dozen German officers already huddled there. Even they were caught off guard. It might have been comical if it weren't so deadly. Houses burned, shrapnel hissed through the air, and every man kept his head down. Luckily, the tanks never advanced into the village itself. They fired a few rounds, then pulled back, leaving scorched buildings behind them. While I waited, a unit of Russian SS troops passed through the village, heading toward the front. They were volunteers, technically comrades, and we were told they were trustworthy. But we watched them with suspicion, and rightly so. Later I heard they'd turned on their officers, shot them, and defected to the enemy. Eventually, transport for the wounded arrived, and I was loaded aboard. We began the journey south, back toward Latvia. Along the way, we passed long convoys of German tanks, trucks, and infantry, part of the Viking SS division and other reserve formations, all moving to reinforce the collapsing front in Estonia. I was dropped off at Smiltene, where the military hospital was already overflowing. I spent a few days there recovering. My face began to heal, though the ache never quite faded. After a few days, more wounded arrived, and I was given my orders, returned to duty. No one knew exactly where Battle Group Jekyll was stationed. My papers instructed me to report to the artillery barracks in Riga, where the unit's headquarters staff was still located. I boarded a narrow-gauge train from Smiltene to Valmiera, then found an empty goods wagon and fell asleep on a bed of straw. When I woke, the train had stopped at Cessis. I opened the sliding door and spotted two young recruits walking along the platform. They asked to join me, and I welcomed them aboard. They had food, a full ham, several bottles of drink, and we made a night of it, sitting cross-legged around a suitcase with a candle on top, eating, talking, laughing, as if the war were miles away. The train rolled slowly through Riga the next morning, not stopping at the main station, but continuing on across the bridges before finally halting at Tornakalns. That worked perfectly for me. I'd removed the plaster from my cheek and didn't look wounded anymore. Without drawing attention, I slipped away and went to find my mother at her workplace to retrieve the keys to our flat. I spent a few precious days at home, cleaning my uniform and rifle, resting, eating properly. My posting orders had technically expired, but I knew I'd have to report back soon. At the barracks, only a few were left, the company clerk and a couple of others. No one knew where the unit had gone. Until orders came, I was assigned to guard the property and personal gear the men had left behind. That was on August 17th. I remained in Riga for 3 weeks. Despite the war, I could go home when I pleased. It was an odd luxury. Officially, all leave had been cancelled, but the front was shifting so fast that chaos had loosened the rules. Russian aircraft flew over Riga daily, but our anti-aircraft defences kept most of them at bay. Refugees poured into the city. Many were already leaving Latvia altogether, heading for Germany by train or ship. Then, in early September, the sergeant major returned from the front. He was here to gather any men still in the city and bring us back. He told us the company had been in hard fighting near Ape after leaving Vero. They had managed to hold the line against repeated Soviet assaults and were now attached to the 19th Latvian SS division, operating somewhere in central Latvia. We prepared to move out. I took a few hours of leave to say goodbye to my mother. She wasn't home. I waited briefly, then left a note, ate a few slices of bread and jam, and walked out, not realizing it would be the last time I'd ever see that home. That evening, we boarded a train and travelled for a few hours to Yeriki, where we were supposed to change trains. We slept in the waiting room that night, only to discover the next morning that our train had left without us. No one seemed to mind. We passed the day drinking, playing cards, even coaxed 2 women to join us. That evening, someone found more drink, and by nightfall we were deep into it. We missed the next train as well, Eventually, the station master had enough. He summoned the military police, who stopped the next passing train and threw us aboard. It was nothing but open flatbed cars, so we shivered in the wind the entire way. Another group of soldiers were riding further up, huddled around a milk churn filled with home-distilled vodka. One of them, drunk and trying to stay warm, began running back and forth across the cars, leaping over the couplings. He slipped, fell between two wagons. The train screeched to a halt. We gathered his broken body and wrapped it in a ground sheet. Then we rolled on in silence. Later, the sergeant major realized he had left his briefcase, full of documents, back in Iriki. He couldn't face returning to the unit without it. I was the only one who spoke fluent German, so I was chosen to retrieve it. He wrote me fresh orders, and I took the next train back. This one was better. I rode in a horse wagon, lying in straw, and slept most of the way. I recovered the briefcase and rejoined the others the following evening. We spent one more night sleeping in a barn. Then, finally, we rejoined the front line. The journey had taken 5 days to cover barely 100 miles. It felt surreal. I was assigned to the reserve section, quartered in a farmhouse cellar about half a mile behind the trenches. From there, we could see the entire line stretching across the low hills, offering a clear view of Soviet movements. The front in that sector was relatively quiet. The Russians shelled us now and then with mortars and sent patrols into no man's land by night, but nothing serious. At night, aircraft buzzed overhead, bombing our supply routes, dodging the flak. One evening, we captured a Soviet pilot who'd been shot down. He tried to sneak back to his lines, but was caught in daylight. He trembled as we brought him in, convinced we'd shoot him on sight. When he saw our SS insignia, he nearly collapsed, but we gave him a cigarette, a drink, and within minutes he was talking, bitterly complaining about how the Red Army treated its own men. The next night, we received orders to move into no man's land and observe. We set out in silence, crossed our own lines, and made our way toward the charred ruins of a farmhouse. We paused just outside, lying in the frozen grass, listening for nearly an hour, not a sound. Eventually, the commander gave the signal. We stood, stretched our stiff limbs, and entered the ruins, rifles raised. The house had burned to its foundations, the floor collapsed into the cellar. 2 men stayed outside to keep watch, while the rest of us slipped into the cold black hole beneath the earth, huddling for warmth. And so we waited for morning. The night passed without any incidents, and as the sun rose, the 2 sentries were withdrawn into the cellar as they were too exposed, and we could, in any case, see everything we needed through the small windows of the cellar. Around breakfast time, our artillery started firing ranging rounds along the Russian front line. The shells crept nearer and nearer to us until we expected the next salvo to fall right on top of the farm. It would have been impossible to move out of the cellar and seek better cover, and we had to rely on our good luck. When the shells arrived and exploded on the ruins, we were showered with bricks and rubble, but did not suffer any casualties. We didn't like being fired on by our own guns, but on the other hand, we reasoned that it would convince the Russians the farm was not occupied, and we should be left in peace all day by the enemy. Later that day, we heard the Russians sawing wood in the forest directly in front of us, and also some hammering and shouting. They were obviously unaware of our presence, and were getting on with building bunkers and fortifications. Through binoculars, we could see a Russian soldier digging a slit trench right in the middle of a field. When he had finished, he carefully camouflaged it and slowly strolled back to the woods. It would have been easy to have shot him, but we did not dare give away our presence. Instead, we carefully noted the position of the trench so that our patrols could deal with the Russian listening post the following night. Once it was dark, we left the ruins and dug a well-concealed position for our machine gun in the orchard. Around midnight, our replacements arrived, and after pointing out the direction of the enemy to them, we left the ruined farm. When we reached our own lines, we reported to the company commander and went down into the cellar once more to sleep. We spent the next day resting. Someone managed to organize a little flour and a few eggs, and we made a real feast of pancakes with some jam, which we had found in the farm's larder. We slept all afternoon, but in the evening were ordered to join the neighbouring company in the trenches. Once more, the front line was being withdrawn a couple of miles, and 2 groups of legionnaires were to remain in the trenches as a rearguard. When we arrived, the company had already left. A sergeant showed us the part of the line that we were to man, and left wishing us the best of luck. It was a dark and windy autumn night. The unfamiliar surroundings and the knowledge that we were on our own in trenches normally occupied by a whole company made us nervous and suspicious of any noise. We would have liked to have sent up some flares to see what lay ahead, but did not dare in case it aroused the enemy. All we could do was walk along our sector of trenches, firing off the occasional shot to maintain the impression of a fully manned front line. Once more I had a machine gun and spent the long night lugging it from place to place, firing into the darkness, reloading the magazine and watching for any signs of Russian patrols approaching our trenches. By first light I was frozen and shivering, and my eyes kept closing. Then I heard from no man's land a sound which had me instantly alert. There, somewhere in the bushes to our front, I could clearly distinguish a Russian voice calling out instructions in an agitated manner. The next moment, a salvo of shells landed somewhere behind us, and the Russians started shouting again. Another salvo of shells exploded moments later, and now it became clear that the Russian was correcting the enemy's artillery. It also seemed likely that the Russians were preparing to attack, but because of the bushes to our immediate front, we could not actually see the approach of the enemy. I could still hear the Russian's voice and tried unsuccessfully to silence him by firing into the bushes. Very soon shells were exploding right on top of us, with anti-tank guns and mortars joining in. With the bombardment really heavy now, all we could do was cower in the trenches, waiting for it to end, and the infantry assault to begin. After bringing up extra ammunition and preparing hand grenades, we were ready. The concentrated shell and mortar fire lasted about 15 minutes before ending abruptly. At the same moment, we could see enemy infantry emerging from the bushes and running towards us. Everything now depended on us. The moment of truth had arrived. Luckily, the Russian artillery and mortar fire had lifted to our rear, so they did not hit their own men. And to prevent our reserves from reaching the threatened front line, we were still under fire from Russian machine guns but had to ignore them. When we saw the enemy, they were about 300 yards away, and at that moment we started firing. The first burst from my machine gun fell short. I could see the grass and earth spurting up in front of the Russians. A quick adjustment of my aim brought results, and with my next burst several Ivans fell, as if hit by an invisible hand. 3 of them remained motionless on the ground, while a 4th one tried to crawl into the cover of some bushes, but did not get far before collapsing. Although suffering heavy losses, the Russians kept coming forward, but when the scattered groups of enemy soldiers were only about 80 yards from us, they came upon an invisible obstacle which stopped them in their tracks. There, in front of our trenches, sappers had cut down some young trees, leaving the short stumps hidden in the grass, and had attached lengths of barbed wire to them. As the Russians advanced across the belt of barbed wire, we were able to pick them off with ease. By now they were also within range of our hand grenades, and very soon those Ivans who were still alive started to run back in panic. Very few of them reached the cover of the bushes, and many dead and wounded littered the ground in front of our trenches. We were excited and jubilant, shouting to each other and continuing to fire into the bushes. Any enemy wounded who were still moving in no man's land were shot dead. The company commander walked along the trench distributing cigarettes and congratulating the men. We hoped that the Russians would not attack a second time, but they thought differently. Half an hour later we once again heard their forward observation officer directing the enemy's batteries, and down came the shells a short while later. For the first quarter of an hour their fire was directed at the barbed wire, after which the shells fell once more on the front line. We crouched in the trench, waiting for the end of the bombardment and the next attack. While cowering from the shell fire, I had my right hand above my head holding on to the top of one of the trench support posts. A small splinter hit it and passed through my palm, and although I did not feel any pain, the impact was like a heavy blow, and then my hand became numb. I could not hold the machine gun any longer and handed it over to my number 2, taking his place myself. I managed to stop the flow of blood somewhat by bandaging it, and that was all I could do for the time being. When the next enemy attack came, my job was to hand full magazines to the new number 1 on the gun. The Russians must have expected to get through the barbed wire without much difficulty, but they did not even get to it. During the preliminary bombardment, one of our machine guns had taken up a new position, right in the middle of no man's land, and well in front of our trenches. Even as the enemy troops started advancing in the open, this gun began firing long bursts. The surprise was complete, and the effect devastating. After losing many men to our concentrated fire, the Red soldiers turned and ran back. This time we knew that we had won the day. During the action, my hand had not bothered me much, but now it had become stiff and swollen, and the blood was soaking through the bandage. The company commander dressed it once more and sent me to the rear. I was to look after the company's supply unit and stay with it until the situation concerning the new front line became clear. I needed no encouragement to leave the front line. Being unable to defend myself, I was scared and wanted to go as soon as possible. One of my friends had already been out in no man's land and had collected a Russian machine pistol from one of the dead. Before I left, he handed me the weapon, and I immediately felt better. I put the pistol's lanyard around my neck, grabbed the handle in my left fist, and jumped out of the trench. First I had to cross an open field, and even as I was doing so, the Russians renewed their bombardment. The shells exploded all around me, so that for a moment I became confused and threw myself into a shell hole to seek shelter, but soon realized that I stood a good chance of being hit once more if I stayed there. I jumped out of the hole and ran quickly towards the trees. Once into the wood, I was comparatively safe, so rested for a while before going on. Beyond the wood, and after crossing some more fields, I reached a road where a car soon overtook me. It stopped, and a Latvian officer offered me a lift. I was driven back 5 miles and I started to look for the supply unit, eventually being told that it had left that morning. It took me the rest of the day to find divisional headquarters, and even there nobody seemed to know the location of our supply unit, probably as all withdrawing units were still on the move. I therefore spent the night at divisional headquarters, and in the morning I still could not find out where I was supposed to go. My hand was aching by now, and I needed medical attention, which I decided to look for on my own. The nearest casualty collecting station was 10 miles away, and I walked all the way. Fortunately, it was a fine autumn day. While I was resting in some woods to the side of the road, a deserter passed quite close without seeing me. I could hear him approaching, however quietly the man tried to move, and kept him in the sights of my machine pistol all the time. He must have been desperate and would not have hesitated to shoot me, thinking I would try to stop him. I reached the casualty collecting station in the afternoon, had my bandage changed, and was then sent to the railway station where a Red Cross train was already waiting. We reached Cesis after dark. Before being admitted to hospital, all the wounded were first sent for a shower and their clothes were deloused. I did not stay in Cesis for long. The very next day, with the Russians approaching, the hospital was evacuated. There was not enough transport for everyone, so walking wounded had to walk along the highway towards Riga. When I left the hospital, the enemy were quite near the town, and I could hear the sounds of battle quite clearly. Some soldiers were looting a shop and passing out bottles of drink, tinned food and biscuits through a broken window. German sappers were busy blowing up the larger buildings and mining the streets. The road to Riga was packed with troops, transport vehicles and wagons and civilian refugees. It was actually quicker to walk through the fields off the road. Now and then Russian aircraft flew low along the road, shooting up and bombing the traffic. There was no sign of the Luftwaffe, so the enemy had a free hand. After walking 5 miles or so, the wounded were stopped and gathered together near a village. A short while later, buses arrived and we boarded them for the drive to Riga, which we reached that night. The town was very quiet and dark, most of those out on the streets being soldiers. The civilians were all in their homes, behind blacked-out windows. Our bus stopped near the station, and while the driver went to make inquiries about our destination, I went into a house to ask for a drink, as I was thirsty. I got the drink of water all right, but the attitude of the working-class family was quite different to the usual enthusiastic welcome reserved for Latvian legionnaires. They expected the Russians to enter the town very soon, and did not wish to be branded as collaborators. When we set off again, we were driven out of the city, and finally, late that night, were housed in an empty textile mill on the outskirts of Riga, near Ugla. The looms of the factory had been removed from the long spinning and weaving halls, and in their place were beds for the wounded, who were to be examined by army doctors who decided each man's destination. The sorting of the wounded continued throughout the next day. Some men were issued with orders to travel to Germany to convalesce, while those with minor injuries were ordered to report to local hospitals, presumably for re-employment at the front line in the near future.